There are empires that history remembers, and there are empires that history fears. In the heart of West Africa, where forests met the savanna and rivers ran thick with alluvial gold, one kingdom rose to define an entire region and to challenge an entire world. The Ashanti Empire, a civilization grounded in sacred authority, extraordinary wealth, and warriors so disciplined they made even the most powerful colonial forces bleed for every inch of ground. This is the story of how they rose, how they fought, and how even when the empire fell, the spirit never did. The story of the Ashanti does not begin with European ships appearing on the horizon. It begins in a world far older, far wealthier, and far more sophisticated than those sailors could imagine. West Africa in the centuries before the Ashanti Empire was not a blank canvas. It was a living, breathing civilizational landscape layered with kingdoms, trade networks, and cultural traditions that stretched back thousands of years. The great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai had already risen and fallen across the western Sudan, leaving behind a legacy of sophisticated governance, Islamic scholarship, and transcontinental commerce. Gold, that most magnetic of metals, had long been the engine of this world. Centuries before Europe understood the scope of West African wealth, Arab geographers wrote with astonishment about kings who kept dogs with golden collars and tied their horses with golden ropes. The forest zone of what is today southern Ghana was home to the Akan-speaking peoples, a broad family of related ethnic groups who shared a common linguistic heritage and a set of deeply interwoven cultural values. Among these peoples were the Asani, the Font, the Danira, the Aim, the Bono, and others. They were farmers, hunters, traders, and craftsmen. They lived in settlements organized around clans, each tracing its lineage through the maternal line, a matrilineal system that would become one of the most distinctive features of Ashanti civilization. The forest they inhabited was both a resource and a shield. It was dense, difficult for outsiders to navigate, and alive with gold. The Akan peoples had developed early techniques for extracting alluvial gold from rivers and for mining it from the earth. And this gold made them central nodes in a trade network connecting the forest zone to the Saharan regions in the north and increasingly to the Atlantic coast in the south. Long before European contact, commerce was moving northward to the markets of Jin and Timbuktu, and from there across the desert to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. But wealth without political unity is vulnerability. In the centuries before the Ashanti rose, the Akan-speaking peoples of the forest zone existed as a collection of competing chieftaincies and small states, constantly vying for control of gold fields, trade routes, and fertile land. The strongest of these early states in the region was Danira, a powerful kingdom that had by the late 17th century extended its dominance over much of the forest zone and imposed tribute obligations on many surrounding Akan groups, including the Asani. Danira was wealthy, militarily formidable, and politically assertive. Its kings controlled access to the coast and to the European traders who had begun establishing fortified posts along the shoreline. It was under this yoke that the Asante people lived as the 17th century entered its final decades, paying tribute, chafing under foreign domination, and in the forests of the interior, beginning to dream of something else entirely. The Asani were not a single unified people in the beginning. They were a collection of clans, each with its own chief, its own stool of authority, and its own identity. In their political culture, the stool was not merely a piece of furniture. It was the repository of the community's soul, the spiritual vessel that connected the living to the ancestors and to the earth itself. To sit on a chief stool was to embody the history and future of an entire people. This concept would become central to everything the Ashanti Empire would later build. Among these Asani clans, some of the most prominent were settled in the area around a series of small settlements in the forest interior. Oral tradition tells of migrations of groups moving southward from the savanna, others moving inland from older coastal settlements, gathering in the rich heartland of the forest. These migrations were not random wanderings. They were strategic movements driven by the search for better land, more reliable water sources, and crucially, greater proximity to the gold that made all other forms of wealth possible. The Asante clans were organized around the matrilineal Abuswapanyan or clan. A person belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's. Inheritance flowed through the female line. Political succession passed from a chief to his brother or to his sister's son, never to his own children. This was not merely a social custom. It was a sophisticated political mechanism. By tying authority to the maternal line, Akan societies created a system in which the most powerful women, the queen mothers, held enormous influence over who would rule and how. A queen mother had the right to nominate candidates for the stool. She had the right to depose a chief who governed poorly. She was the living embodiment of the ancestral line, and her word carried weight that no warrior's sword could easily override. This matrilineal foundation meant that even in its early pre-imperial phase, the society had a built-in mechanism for political accountability. Chiefs could be removed. Power was not absolute. The community had a stake in governance, and the Queen Mother was the guardian of that stake. It is within this rich cultural and political context that we must place the emergence of the most consequential figure in Ashanti history. A man who would take these scattered clans, bind them together through military genius and sacred authority, and forge an empire that would endure for 2 centuries. His name was Osei Tutu. The precise details of Osei Tutu's early life are filtered through oral tradition. And oral tradition in any society is never neutral. It amplifies, condenses, and draws meaning from events rather than simply recording them. Yet even allowing for the embellishments of memory and myth, the historical record is clear on the essential points. Osei Tutu was a man of extraordinary political intelligence, military capability, and, crucially, the right alliances. Born into the Oyoko clan of the Asante, he spent formative years at the courts of other kingdoms, including a period at the court of Denaira, the very power that dominated his people, and time at the court of Akwamu, a powerful Akan state to the east. These experiences were not merely biographical footnotes. They were an education in governance and statecraft. Tutu observed how powerful states were organized, how armies were commanded, how tribute was extracted, and how loyalty was maintained. He also experienced firsthand the humiliation of Asante subordination to Denaira. That experience appears to have crystallized in him a determination to overturn the existing order. It was at the court of Akwamu that Tutu forged the relationship that would define his political career and alter the history of West Africa. He met Okomfo Anakai, a priest, a spiritual figure, and by all accounts, one of the most remarkable political operators of his era. Anakai would become Tutu's chief advisor, spiritual legitimizer, and the architect of the most powerful piece of political symbolism in Ashanti history. But we will come to that moment in its proper time. When Tutu returned to the Asante heartland, now ascended to the position of a Sanahin or paramount chief, he faced a problem that every state builder encounters at the beginning. He had ambition, intelligence, and a talented inner circle. What he needed most was unity. The Asante clans were accustomed to their autonomy. Each chief jealously guarded his own stool of authority. The idea of subordinating that pride to a higher authority, of binding individual communities into a single political body, was not something that could be achieved by force alone. One could conquer people, but not their sense of self. For unity to be real and lasting, it had to be sacred. This is where Okomfo Anakai performed what Ashanti tradition records as his greatest act. Scholars estimate the year as around 1701. The chiefs of the Asante clans had gathered at Kumasi, the settlement that Tutu had chosen as his capital, situated at a crossroads of forest paths that gave it strategic and commercial importance. The gathering was significant but tense. These were proud men, each representing a lineage and a community with its own history. Asking them to acknowledge a paramount authority was asking them to accept a diminishment of status that their traditions did not easily permit. And then, According to legend, Anakai descended from the sky. In reality, he produced an object of such spiritual force, so carefully engineered, that would unite these rival chieftains more effectively than any army could. It was a stool, but not merely a stool of gold, appearing miraculously from the heavens, settling gently on Tutu's knees to the sound of thunder and the shaking of the earth. Anakai declared that this was the Sika Awa Kofi, the golden stool, and he declared that within it lived the Sun Sum, the soul of the entire Ashani nation. Every Asani person alive, every ancestor who had ever lived, every descendant yet to be born, all of them were contained in this single sacred object. The political genius of this moment cannot be overstated. In a culture where the stool was already the most powerful symbol of community identity, the golden stool did not replace the individual clan stools. It transcended them. It sat above them literally and metaphorically. The chiefs kept their own stools, their own authority within their own territories. But they now acknowledged that above all of these was a higher stool, a higher authority, a higher community, the Ashani nation as a whole. They swore oaths. They offered their loyalty. And they became, in that moment, the founding council of what would grow into one of the most formidable empires West Africa had ever seen. Crucially, the golden stool was never set upon. Not by Tutu, not by any subsequent Asanihin. It was carried on a cushion beside the king during ceremonies. It had its own retinue of attendants, its own food offerings, its own wives. To sit upon the golden stool would have been to crush the soul of the nation, an act of sacrilege so profound it was barely conceivable. The stool was not a throne in the European sense. It was something more intimate and more terrifying than that. It was the people. This distinction mattered enormously in the wars to come. When the British would eventually seek to humiliate the Ashanti by demanding the golden stool for the governor to sit upon, they revealed in that single act how completely they had misunderstood what they were dealing with. With the spiritual foundation of the Confederacy established, Tutu and Anakai turned to the practical work of building a state. And this was not a simple or passive undertaking. The Ashanti Confederacy that emerged in the early 18th century was one of the most sophisticated political constructions in African history. A federal system centuries before the word federation had entered the vocabulary of most political thinkers anywhere in the world. The Confederacy was organized around the concept of the Asantman, the Ashani nation. At its apex sat the Asanihin and Kumasi, the paramount king whose authority was both political and spiritual. But the structure beneath him was not a simple hierarchy of command. It was a careful balance of powers. The outlying Asani chieftaincies, Dwayben, Bekwe, Nsuda, Koku, and others, were the founding members of the Confederacy. Their chiefs, the Amenhin, retained significant autonomy within their own territories. They administered local affairs, collected taxes, and maintained their own courts. But in matters of war, diplomacy, and national policy, they owed loyalty and military service to Kumasi. The Asantehene governed with the advice and consent of a council, the Ashanti Confederacy Council, in which the chiefs of the constituent states had representation. Major decisions, including declarations of war, required consultation and consensus. This was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was far from despotism. A king who ignored his council risked dalment, the Ashani equivalent of removal from office, a sanction that the Queen Mother and senior chiefs could invoke if a ruler governed badly or acted against the nation's interests. The legal system that Ose, Tutu, and Okomfo Anakai established was codified through a set of laws reportedly proclaimed by Anakai himself that governed conduct within Ashani society. These laws addressed everything from the proper conduct of oath-swearing to the rules of inheritance, from the rights of slaves within households to the procedures for resolving disputes between chiefs. They were enforced by the king's officials, the Gasahin, who administered the palace and its affairs, and by a network of state functionaries who carried the king's authority into every corner of the Confederacy. The capital, Kumasi, grew rapidly into a city worthy of the empire it administered. Visitors in later centuries would describe it with unmistakable awe. Wide streets, well-built houses, a central market that drew traders from hundreds of miles in every direction, and a palace complex that was the nerve center of a continental commercial and political network. The city was not merely the administrative capital of the empire. It was its beating heart, the place where gold was weighed, where policy was made, where ambassadors were received, and where festivals celebrated the unity of the people and the power of their king. The confederacy that Osei Tutu had built was remarkable, but it was constrained. To the south and west, Denaira still dominated, still extracted tribute, and still reminded the Asani of their subordinate status. This could not stand, not for reasons of pride alone, but for the most pragmatic of reasons. Control of the gold fields and the trade routes to the coast was key to wealth and power. As long as Denaira stood between the Asante and the coast, the empire's economic potential was capped. The war against Denaira, fought around 1701, was decisive. The Asani forces, reorganized and newly confident under Osei Tutu's military reforms, defeated the Denaira army in a battle that shattered the old regional order. The Denaira king was killed. The tributary relationship was reversed. With Denaira's fall, the Asante gained direct access to the coastal trade, including the European forts and trading posts that had operated on the Gold Coast for 2 centuries. This victory set the template for Ashanti expansion over the following century. Military force applied with discipline and strategic intelligence, followed by careful political integration of conquered territories. Peoples who submitted were incorporated into the Confederacy as subject states, required to pay tribute and provide military levies, but allowed to retain their internal governance and often their own customs. Peoples who resisted faced more stringent treatment. Yet the Ashanti, by the standards of their era and by any objective assessment, were pragmatic empire builders rather than merely destructive conquerors. Under the successors of Osei Tutu, a remarkable series of capable rulers, including Uko Thorn, Osei Quado, and Osei Bono, the empire expanded dramatically. Northward, the Ashanti pushed into the Savannah zone, bringing trading states like Ganja and Dagbon under their orbit. Eastward, they contested territory with the Akim. Southward, they established relationships of trade and sometimes dominance with the coastal Font states, who served as intermediaries with European merchants. By the mid-18th century, the Ashanti Empire encompassed a territory of roughly 250,000 square kilometers and commanded a population of several million people. Gold remained the engine of this expansion, but it was not the only fuel. The Ashanti state was a sophisticated economic operator. It controlled the production and distribution of gold through a royal monopoly. All gold nuggets above a certain size were the property of the Asantehene. The working of gold into jewelry, regalia, and trade items was a specialized craft practiced by skilled artisans whose products were renowned across the continent for their beauty and technical sophistication. The famous gold weights, tiny brass figures used to measure gold dust in trade, were themselves miniature works of art, representing proverbs, animals, human figures, and abstract patterns that encoded the values and worldview of Ashanti civilization. The expansion of the Ashanti Empire was not achieved by diplomacy alone. Behind every political negotiation, every tributary relationship, and every act of incorporation stood the Ashanti army, one of the most formidable military forces in the history of West Africa. Understanding how the Ashanti military functioned is essential to understanding how the empire itself operated. The Ashanti army was not a standing professional force in the European sense. It was instead a mobilization system of extraordinary efficiency, a mechanism through which the entire productive male population of the empire could be rapidly transformed into an organized fighting force. Every adult male within the Confederacy was, in principle, a soldier. Yet the army was organized into units reflecting the political structure of the state. Each constituent chieftaincy contributed its own contingent, commanded by its own officers, but integrated into a broader hierarchy under the leadership of the Asantehene and his senior military chiefs. The army was divided into 5 main divisions: the advance guard, the right wing, the left wing, the rear guard, and the main body, each with its own commander and assigned role in battle. The advance guard, known as the Adanten, was typically the first to engage the enemy. The main body, the Asante Kitoko, the name itself meaning porcupine, a symbol of defensive strength whose quills could strike in all directions, was where the king and his elite warriors fought. Ashanti tactics combined careful intelligence gathering with aggressive flanking maneuvers. They were masters of forest warfare, using the dense interior vegetation to conceal movements, to ambush enemies who assumed such terrain was impassable, and to supply their forces along hidden paths that outsiders could not follow. They were not simply fierce fighters. They were strategically sophisticated, understanding that the goal of battle was less about individual victories than destroying the enemy's capacity and will to continue fighting. Weapons evolved over time. Traditional bows, spears, and the distinctive Ashanti short sword gradually gave way as trade with Europeans increased to firearms. Muskets were acquired in large quantities in exchange for gold and, increasingly, enslaved people. The Ashanti were quick to adopt new technologies and to develop tactics that maximized their effectiveness in the forested terrain where they held the greatest advantage. But weapons and tactics were only part of the story. What truly made the Ashanti army formidable was discipline, motivation, and the spiritual framework that enveloped military service. Going to war was a sacred act. Warriors prepared through rituals, carried protective amulets, and fought within a framework of obligations to the king, to the nation, to the ancestors, and to the golden stool. Cowardice was one of the most serious social stigmas. A warrior who fled dishonored not only himself, but his entire lineage. Valor in battle was the path to advancement, to honor, and to social recognition that every Ashanti man aspired to achieve. At the heart of the Ashanti Empire's power lay an economic system of remarkable sophistication, one that controlled the production and distribution of one of the ancient world's most coveted commodities, connecting the empire to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Gold was ubiquitous in the Ashanti world. It lay in the forest earth, extracted through careful mining and river panning. It circulated in the marketplace as dust or nuggets, weighed on precision brass scales using the famous Ashanti gold weights. It adorned the palace, hammered and cast into regalia of breathtaking beauty. Headdresses, breastplates, rings, sword hilts, and ceremonial staffs communicating state power and sophistication to ambassadors and traders who entered Kamasi's great court. Gold also traveled northward along ancient Saharan trade routes, eventually reaching European coinage, where kingdoms had no knowledge of its origin. The Asantehene maintained strict control over gold production through royal rights and tribute obligations. Local chiefs were required to surrender a portion of all gold extracted in their territories to the central authority. Large nuggets went directly to the king. Centralized control over gold production was not merely about accumulating wealth for its own sake. It was the foundation of state power. Gold financed the army, purchased firearms from European traders, and supported the network of diplomats and administrators that kept the Confederacy functioning. Gold in the Ashanti world was politics made material. Trade in kola nuts represented another pillar of the Ashanti economy. Kola nuts, which grew in the forest zone and produced a mild stimulant effect when chewed, were highly valued in the Islamic trading world of the Savannah and Sahara, where alcohol was prohibited but kola was allowed. Ashanti merchants controlled the main kola-producing forests and organized northward trade, leveraging the empire's geographic position between forest zones where kola grew and savanna markets where it was consumed. A single caravan transporting kola north from Kamasi represented enormous commercial value. The slave trade, a subject requiring honest and unflinching examination, was also a significant component of the Ashanti economy, particularly as European demand intensified in the 18th century. The Ashanti, like many powerful regional states, participated actively in the transatlantic slave trade, selling prisoners of war and people obtained through raiding and tribute obligations to European merchants on the coast. This participation must be understood in historical context without excusing it. Slavery existed within Ashanti society itself, although the status of enslaved people was complex and distinct from plantation chattel slavery. The sale of people into the transatlantic trade was partially driven by the demand for imported firearms, which the Ashanti required to maintain their military advantage. The Ashanti military, disciplined and strategically adept, and the economic control over gold and trade, including both Kola and enslaved people, formed an integrated system. Wealth funded war, and war secured wealth. The army ensured that tribute flowed and that trade routes remained open and protected. Every political, economic, and military institution was interdependent, creating a resilient structure that allowed the Ashanti Empire to expand its influence and maintain stability over a vast and diverse territory. Understanding these interconnections is key to understanding Ashanti power. Their military was not only an instrument of conquest, but a guardian of the economic and political order. The spiritual obligations surrounding warfare reinforced loyalty and discipline, while the control of gold and strategic trade commodities secured the material foundation of the empire. Together, these elements made the Ashanti Confederacy one of the most formidable states in African history. It was a brutal and destructive commerce that left deep and lasting wounds across West African societies, and the Ashanti were both participants and, over time, occasional targets, as their own people were sometimes seized and sold into the transatlantic trade. This is one of the more difficult truths of Ashanti history, and it deserves acknowledgement without sensationalism or exaggeration. Great civilizations are rarely simple. They contain both extraordinary achievements and serious moral failures. The Ashanti Empire was no exception. By the midpoint of its history, the Ashanti had built complex systems of political thought in the forest, transformed gold into governance, and confronted the greatest challenge any nation can face: the organized power of a colonizing empire determined to acquire everything within its sight. By the time the Ashanti Empire had consolidated authority and established Kumasi as one of Africa's great cities, Europeans had been present on the Gold Coast for more than 2 centuries. The Portuguese arrived first, establishing trading posts in the late 15th century. The Dutch, Swedes, Danes, and British followed, competing in succession for access to gold and, increasingly, to human beings who could be sold into the growing plantation economies of the Americas. By the 17th century, the Gold Coast was dotted with fortified European trading posts: Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, Accra, each serving as a node in a network of Atlantic commerce, transforming both Europe and the Americas at Africa's expense. The initial relationship between the Ashanti and Europeans was primarily commercial. The Ashanti sought firearms, cloth, and metal goods, while the Europeans desired gold and increasingly enslaved people. Both parties possessed what the other required, and for a time, this relationship was managed through negotiation, mediated by coastal font traders who acted as intermediaries between the interior empire and European forts. This created a careful balance of mutual interest that restrained the worst impulses on both sides. The Font states on the coast occupied a complicated and ambivalent position. They were fellow Akan peoples, sharing deep cultural ties with the Ashanti, but had developed close working relationships with Europeans, granting them commercial advantages that the interior Ashanti envied. The Font acted as middlemen, controlling the flow of goods between Kumasi and the coast, and they were not enthusiastic about Ashanti efforts to expand direct access to European trade. This tension between the coastal Font and interior Ashanti became a defining political dynamic of the Gold Coast, one that European powers, particularly the British, learned to exploit with skill. By the early 19th century, the British had emerged as the dominant European power on the Gold Coast. They had purchased the remaining Dutch trading posts and established a near monopoly on legitimate trade along most of the coastline. Their relationship with the Ashanti was complex from the beginning. a mixture of commercial partnership, political suspicion, military deterrence, and deep cultural incomprehension, as two fundamentally different systems of governance and values confronted one another across an immense cultural divide. British representatives dealing with the Ashanti in the early 19th century found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They were accustomed to negotiating with African rulers from assumed superiority, only to find that the Ashanti did not allow this assumption to stand. Asantehene Ose Bonsu, who ruled in the early decades of the 19th century, received British diplomats in a court of extraordinary splendor and conducted negotiations with political sophistication that left his visitors struggling to maintain footing. He asked pointed questions about British intentions, challenged the logic of their position on the slave trade, and noted with justification that British merchants had participated enthusiastically for generations, profiting enormously before declaring it illegal. He understood the power of Britain, but was not intimidated by it. The transition from commercial relationship to military conflict between the Ashanti and British was not sudden. It arose from accumulating tensions, territorial disputes, debates over the status of protected peoples, British ambitions to open the interior to direct trade without Ashanti intermediaries, and the underlying reality that two expansionist powers with incompatible worldviews occupied the same geographic space. Eventually, the logic of empire made war inevitable. The first significant Anglo-Ashanti War erupted in 1823 when British Governor Charles McCarthy led a force against the Ashanti, only to be decisively and catastrophically defeated. McCarthy was killed in battle, and Ashanti warriors reportedly used his skull as a ceremonial drinking cup, a detail that British newspapers reported with horror. This event crystallized in the British public imagination an image of the Ashanti as savage and threatening. The reality was more complex. In many African military traditions, the skull of a defeated enemy, especially a leader, was considered a trophy of honor, a recognition of the enemy's power rather than contempt. The British, however, interpreted it through a lens of fear and moral judgment. Conflict between the two powers flared repeatedly through the 19th century. In 1826, at the Battle of Catamanso, a combined British and Font force employed artillery, including rockets, to defeat an Ashanti army that had never before encountered such weapons in pitched open-field combat. The Ashanti fell back, not broken, but recalibrating. They were a military culture that learned from experience, adapting to ensure that European technological superiority would not catch them off guard in the future. The Ashanti Empire's resilience rested on the integration of political, economic, and military systems. Its army was disciplined, strategically sophisticated, and supported by a society that placed immense value on bravery, loyalty, and spiritual obligation. Its economy, powered by gold, cola, and participation in the slave trade, provided the material foundation for expansion, defense, and governance. The spiritual framework surrounding military service reinforced unity, ensuring that warriors understood that their actions on the battlefield affected the nation, the king, the ancestors, and the golden stool. Understanding this integration, the disciplined army centralized control of gold and other commodities, careful political incorporation of subordinate territories, and the spiritual and cultural cohesion illuminates why the Ashanti resisted European powers for so long, expanded their influence, and maintained a sophisticated, resilient empire in the heart of West Africa. Their story exemplifies political acumen, strategic innovation, and the combination of economic, military, and spiritual systems in a pre-colonial African state. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War, fought from 1873 to 1874, was the most serious confrontation between the Ashanti Empire and the British. The British, under General Garnet Wolseley, dispatched a well-prepared professional force into the interior of the Gold Coast with the explicit goal of capturing and burning Kumasi. Wolseley was a disciplined commander who understood the challenges of forest warfare. He meticulously prepared his expedition, cutting roads through dense bush, stockpiling supplies, and drilling African auxiliaries alongside his British troops. The campaign was brutal for both sides. The Ashanti resisted with extraordinary determination, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain to contest every mile of the British advance. When Wolseley's force reached Kumasi in February 1874, the city was largely empty. The Ashanti population had withdrawn and set much of the city aflame before the British arrived. The 1874 Treaty of Fomena that followed was humiliating on paper. The Ashanti were compelled to renounce claims over certain territories and pay a heavy indemnity. Yet the essential reality remained that the British had burned a city and then departed. The Ashanti state endured. The golden stool, the spiritual and political symbol of the nation, was not seized. The Asantehene remained on his throne, and the empire continued functioning. Within a few years, the Ashanti rebuilt Kumasi and restored their authority across the interior. The Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War, from 1895 to 1896, was less a conventional military engagement than a political maneuver. The British arrived with overwhelming forces. Asantehene Agyeman Prempeh I, recognizing the imbalance of military power, chose not to fight a battle he could not win. He submitted to British authority. Despite this apparent compliance, he was seized in what was widely considered a betrayal of the capitulation terms and exiled first to Sierra Leone and later to the Seychelles. With the king gone, the British declared Ashanti territories a protectorate. For the first time in 2 centuries, the Ashanti were without a paramount ruler. Yet, they remained spiritually and culturally intact. The British assumed that removing the king would complete the process of incorporation. The Ashanti Empire, according to colonial calculations, was now a territory to be administered, taxed, and governed under British policy. They underestimated the resilience of Ashanti institutions and traditions. In January 1900, the British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, visited Kumasi to address the assembled Ashanti chiefs. His speech would spark one of the most remarkable uprisings in African resistance history. Hodgson demanded the golden stool. He stated that he wished to sit upon it as the representative of Queen Victoria, asserting supreme authority over the Ashanti. In essence, he demanded the surrender of the symbolic center of Ashanti civilization, the physical embodiment of the nation's soul, to a foreign official. Silence followed. The chiefs returned home and prepared for war. This conflict, known as the War of the Golden Stool or the Yassaniwa War, was extraordinary not only for its cause, but also because it was led by a woman. Yassaniwa, Queen Mother of the Agis state, was elderly at the time, reportedly in her 60s or 70s. In Ashanti political culture, age and gender did not restrict authority, as queen mothers were traditionally guardians of national values. When male chiefs hesitated, citing military risks and the absence of the exiled Asantehene, Yassaniwa spoke decisively. She reminded the assembly that Ashanti kings had never fled from enemies and declared that if men were afraid to fight, women would rise. Her words reinvigorated the Ashanti chiefs, and she assumed leadership of the uprising. The war began in spring 1900. Ashanti forces besieged the British fort at Kumasi, trapping a significant garrison for months. The rebellion spread across multiple territories, with fighters from numerous chiefdoms joining the cause. The British were initially alarmed and, for a time, unable to suppress the uprising. Reinforcements were dispatched from the coast. The campaign was prolonged and costly for both sides. Ultimately, British resources and organization allowed them to prevail. Yassaniwa was captured and exiled to the Seychelles alongside the Asantehene Prempeh. She died in exile in 1921, never returning to the land she had defended. Despite her capture, Yassaniwa accomplished what military force could not. She proved that the Ashanti were not conquered, merely occupied. The golden stool, the spiritual heart of the nation, remained intact. Loyal Ashanti had hidden it with extreme care throughout the conflict. The British never obtained it, demonstrating their fundamental misunderstanding of Ashanti society. The stool represented unity, authority, and the soul of the people. Its survival symbolized the resilience of Ashanti political and spiritual structures. The War of the Golden Stool illustrates the Ashanti people's courage, strategic skill, and deep social cohesion. Though outmatched by British firepower, the Ashanti preserved their cultural institutions and demonstrated their enduring national spirit. Sanawa's leadership highlighted the centrality of women in Ashanti governance, the sacrality of the Golden Stool, and the ability of society to resist external domination while maintaining its identity. Even in exile and after military setbacks, the Ashanti retained their social and political cohesion. This episode remains a defining moment in Ashanti history. It is a story of courage, leadership, and defense of national identity. The Golden Stool's preservation reinforced the Ashanti people's unity and symbolized their indomitable spirit. Their resistance proved that cultural and spiritual sovereignty could endure even under occupation, establishing an enduring example of African resilience. The Ashanti demonstrated that conquest does not equate to cultural destruction, and their institutions, traditions, and identity remained intact despite colonial pressures, serving as a lasting testament to the strength of African civilization. The Ashanti Empire, once a sovereign and formidable political entity in West Africa, endured centuries of both triumph and tribulation before being incorporated into the British colonial system. By the early 20th century, it had experienced the collapse of independent political authority following a series of wars and uprisings against colonial forces. Despite the pressures of annexation, displacement of rulers, and the imposition of foreign administration, the soul of Ashanti society, the cultural, spiritual, and institutional frameworks, remained intact. In January 1902, the British formally annexed the Ashanti territories as a crown colony, consolidating their control over the region. This was the formal end of the Ashanti Empire as an independent political entity. Yet, even within this new structure, the Ashanti people retained a distinct cultural identity, a shared history, and the memory of past sovereignty that could not be erased. The British administrative model sought to both utilize and control the existing Ashanti institutions, dismantling some while co-opting others. Chiefs who aligned with colonial interests maintained positions of authority, sometimes even expanding their influence, whereas those who resisted were removed, exiled, or stripped of recognition. This intervention disrupted the carefully maintained constitutional balance that had governed the interplay between the Asantehene, the Queen Mothers, the councils of elders, and constituent chiefs. The imposition of a colonial administrative layer, answering directly to London rather than to the Ashanti people, fundamentally altered the traditional dynamics of governance. Economically, the Gold Coast under British rule shifted toward a cash crop system, emphasizing cocoa production, which integrated the colony into global markets over which Ashanti people had limited control. Traditional gold-based commerce persisted, but was increasingly subordinated to the colonial framework. The extraction of gold became an enterprise managed by colonial authorities and British companies, with a flow of profits redirected away from local communities. The Ashanti Kingdom's prior system of royal oversight of mining and artisanal craft gave way to an external economy prioritizing colonial revenue. Yet the traditions of goldsmithing, regalia production, and ceremonial use of precious metals endured within households and public events. Culturally, the imposition of colonial and missionary systems introduced competing belief structures. Christianity spread widely, but most Ashanti communities integrated new practices into pre-existing spiritual and ceremonial frameworks rather than abandoning their traditional religion entirely. Western-style education, administered through colonial schools and missionary institutions, produced a class of literate, politically aware Ashanti men and women. These individuals were fluent in English, familiar with British law, and capable of using colonial instruments to advance the interests of their communities. This class became the backbone of the nationalist movements that would eventually challenge imperial authority. Despite these upheavals, Ashanti institutions and practices proved resilient. The matrilineal lineage system remained central to social organization, inheritance, and succession. The stool system continued as a symbolic and practical measure of authority, maintaining its role in both ceremonial and administrative contexts. Festivals, most notably the Adwara purification ritual, continued to mark the annual cycle, reinforcing the spiritual and communal bonds between living members, ancestors, and future generations. Craft traditions, including weaving of Kent cloth, wood carving, and the production of gold ornaments, remained vibrant. The craftsmanship not only preserved aesthetic standards, but also communicated cultural narratives and historical memory. One of the most profound symbolic moments under colonial oversight occurred in 1924, when the exiled Assanahene Prempeh, who had been removed from office nearly 3 decades earlier, was allowed to return to the Gold Coast. Though stripped of royal authority and titled simply as a private citizen, Prempeh was received with the respect traditionally accorded to a king. He navigated colonial restrictions with diplomacy and intelligence, advocating for restoration of Ashanti self-governance and the revival of constitutional practices within the Confederacy. In 1926, he was formally recognized as the Chief of Kumasi, symbolizing the partial revival of Ashanti political structures. Following decades of negotiation and advocacy, the British formally restored the Ashanti Confederacy in 1935. The Assanahene was reinstated as the paramount ruler, reclaiming a central place within the political hierarchy of Ashanti society. The 39-year suspension of the position highlighted the endurance of Ashanti political culture and the capacity for legal and ceremonial frameworks to survive under prolonged external pressure. During this period, the golden stool, emblematic of the Ashanti nation's soul, regained prominence. Its rediscovery in 1921, after being accidentally unearthed by road workers, confirmed the continuity of spiritual and symbolic authority. The British, having learned from prior missteps, made no attempt to seize the stool, allowing it to remain under Ashanti custody. Through these transformations, Ashanti society demonstrated remarkable adaptability, negotiating colonial pressures while preserving core cultural and political structures. Into the mid-20th century, nationalist movements gained momentum across the Gold Coast, drawing on both Western political ideas and indigenous governance traditions. The Ashanti people, steeped in centuries of organized political thought, contributed significantly to the push for self-rule. When the Gold Coast achieved independence on March 6, 1957, becoming Ghana, it honored the historical legacy of earlier African states, with the Ashanti Empire occupying a central, respected place within the new national identity. The Ashanti tradition of governance, spirituality, and cultural expression was not consigned to history. It continued to shape social and political life. The Asantehene, alongside the councils of chiefs and queen mothers, maintained ceremonial and advisory functions, providing continuity between past and present. Festivals, craft traditions, and matrilineal structures persisted, adapting to modern circumstances while retaining their historical essence. Today, the Ashanti cultural heritage remains a vibrant, evolving force. The institution of the Assanahene continues to serve as a paramount authority, not merely as a symbolic relic, but as a functional participant in governance and social life in Ghana. The golden stool remains a living emblem of national identity, reminding all of the endurance of Ashanti institutions, the resilience of its people, and the capacity of culture to survive and flourish despite centuries of external pressure and disruption. The story of the Ashanti Empire illustrates that sovereignty, political creativity, and cultural persistence are not merely matters of historical record, but ongoing realities reflected in contemporary Ghanaian society. The current Assanahene, Otumfuo Osei 222, who ascended the Golden Stool in 1999, is among the most respected traditional rulers in Africa. He has used his position to advance education, economic development, peace building, and cultural preservation, and his leadership has been widely recognized both in Ghana and across the continent. Through his mediation of political disputes, founding of educational institutions, and representation of Ashanti culture on the global stage, He combines dignity with contemporary relevance, a combination entirely recognizable to his predecessors. Kente cloth, perhaps the most globally recognized product of Ashanti civilization, has become one of the great symbols of African cultural identity worldwide. Originally woven in the royal workshops of Kumasi for ceremonial use reserved for royalty, Kente has traveled far beyond its origins. It is worn by heads of state, diaspora Africans asserting cultural identity, students at graduation ceremonies, and anyone wishing to demonstrate connection to the depth, beauty, and sophistication of African civilization. Each Kente pattern carries its own name, history, and symbolic meaning, forming a textile library of Ashanti values, aesthetics, and philosophy, woven in silk and cotton, communicating across centuries and continents. Ashanti goldsmithing traditions remain alive, technically sophisticated, and highly respected, producing objects rooted in historical aesthetic conventions, yet responsive to contemporary markets and tastes. The gold weights, miniature brass sculptures once essential for regulating trade within the empire, are now collected by museums worldwide and studied by art historians who recognize them as among the great achievements of African sculptural tradition. Yet these gold weights continue to be made, used in some contexts, and serve as material evidence of an unbroken craft tradition that has survived centuries of change. Ashanti spiritual traditions have demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Many Ashanti are devout Christians, reflecting the long history of missionary activity on the Gold Coast. Yet traditional spiritual practices centered on ancestor veneration, the power of the earth deity Isasia, and the Abuzum, lesser deities mediating between humans and Niam, the supreme creator, have not disappeared. They coexist, compete, and often fuse with Christian practices, producing distinctively Ghanaian forms of spiritual life that draw on both traditions. The matrilineal system persists in modified form in many Ashanti communities, although economic and social changes brought by modernization and urbanization exert pressure on some aspects. The deep sense of clan identity, respect for queen mothers as political and moral authorities, and the understanding that lineage flows through the female line continue to shape Ashanti social life, even as legal, political, and administrative forms evolve to meet contemporary challenges. In the diaspora, among Ghanaian communities in London, Washington, Toronto, Amsterdam, and other cities, Ashanti identity remains a powerful source of pride and belonging. Festivals are recreated in public spaces and community centers. Kente is worn at naming ceremonies, weddings, and graduations, and children are given day names connecting them to the Ashanti ritual calendar, even without ever setting foot in Kumasi. Culture proves extraordinarily portable, surviving displacement and distance. Step back and consider the full arc of Ashanti history, from scattered forest chiefdoms of the 17th century to the gleaming court of Kumasi at the height of imperial power, from the 4 Anglo-Ashanti Wars to the exile of kings and queen mothers, from the formal annexation of 1902 to Ghana's independence in 1957, and to the thriving cultural life of the 21st century. And one sees a civilization of remarkable endurance and creativity. The Ashanti Empire teaches that the African past was not blank or static. West Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries hosted sophisticated states, complex economies, rich intellectual traditions, and durable political institutions. The Ashanti Confederacy was not a primitive tribal system awaiting European governance. It was a federal state with a constitution, an independent judiciary, a professional civil service, a standing army, and a legal system functioning effectively for 2 centuries before British arrival. The empire illustrates the relationship between culture and resilience. Repeatedly, core institutions, the Golden Stool, the matrilineal system, the Queen Mother's authority, craft traditions, and spiritual practices survived conditions that could have destroyed them. They endured because they were embedded not solely in political structures dismantled by colonial administrators, but in the lived practices of families, communities, and individuals. Culture carried in memory and everyday practice is far harder to colonize than territory. The Ashanti Empire also teaches the complexity of historical agency. The Ashanti were not passive victims. They fought, negotiated, adapted, and preserved what mattered most. They produced extraordinary leaders. Osei Tutu I, who built the Confederacy. Yesandawa, who led the last great uprising with courage, still inspiring today. Prempeh the Wonder, who endured decades of exile and returned to advocate for the restoration of Ashanti institutions. These figures shaped history even under severe constraints. The empire demonstrates the endurance of identity under external power. Cultural and political continuity survived colonial imposition, the displacement of rulers, and foreign domination. The golden stool remains the symbol of national identity. Queen mothers continue to wield authority, and festivals, spiritual practices, crafts, and textiles link contemporary communities to centuries of history. Education, commerce, and global representation further reinforce Ashanti relevance. The empire's story shows that African societies could develop complex political institutions, sustain resilient cultural systems, and assert agency despite powerful external pressures. Ashanti history is not a relic. It is living, evolving, and deeply influential, demonstrating that identity, culture, and political creativity can survive conquest and colonization. The modern Asantehene embodies this enduring legacy, linking the contemporary Ashanti world to centuries of achievement and ensuring Ashanti history remains a vital part of global human heritage. The British had guns, ships, resources, and the administrative machinery of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. They burned Kumasi. They sent the Asante into exile. They hung the Union Jack over his palace. And yet, they could not take the golden stool. They could not dissolve the matronal clans. They could not silence the drum languages or unravel the Kent patterns or compel the Ashanti to become something other than what they were. Some things, it appears, cannot be colonized. The golden stool of the Ashanti sits today in the palace at Kumasi in the Republic of Ghana, attended by its custodians and surrounded by the centuries of meaning with which the Ashanti people have invested it. It has survived war, exile, colonial rule, and the churning transformations of the modern world. It has never been sat upon. It has never touched the ground. It carries in the understanding of the Ashanti people the sunsum, the soul of an entire nation. What does it mean for a people to have a soul? Not in a theological sense, but in a cultural one. To have a center of gravity, a point of orientation, a set of values and stories and practices that give coherence and meaning to collective life. The golden stool is a symbol, certainly, but symbols are not nothing. They're in some ways the most powerful things that exist. They're the things that make people fight not for land or resources, but for something they cannot surrender and still be themselves. The Ashanti Empire, in the most fundamental sense, was never fully destroyed. It was compressed. It was constrained. It was forced to operate within spaces defined by others. But it was not annihilated because the essential things, the matrilineal identity, the stool system, the aesthetic traditions, the spiritual practices, the memory of what the Ashanti had built and what they had defended. Those things survived. They were carried through the darkest years and brought forward into a present in which they are not mere curiosities, but living realities. Ghana today is a democracy, one of the most stable and functional democracies on the African continent. It contains within it, in productive tension and creative dialogue, multiple layers of identity and governance. The national institutions of the Republic coexist with the traditional institutions of the Ashanti Confederacy and other chief ties. Modern economic life coexists with cultural practices that stretch back centuries. Christianity coexists with traditional spiritual belief. The modern and the ancestral are not opposites in Ghana. They're conversation partners, each shaped by its engagement with the other. This is the deepest legacy of the Ashanti Empire, not a museum piece, not a memory, not a footnote in a colonial history. It is a living demonstration that identity is more durable than domination, that culture is more persistent than conquest, and that a people who know who they are and refuse to forget cannot ultimately be erased. The warriors of the Gold Coast built something extraordinary in the forest of West Africa. They built it with gold and governance, with sacred authority and military discipline, with the genius of leaders like Oei Tutu and Okono and No, and with the courage of warriors and queen mothers whose names deserve to be spoken wherever the history of human civilization is told. They built it over 200 years of sovereignty. They defended it in 4 wars against a colonial power that brought to bear the full resources of the 19th century's most powerful empire. And when the formal structures of that empire were finally dismantled, they discovered that the most important things they had built had never been captured at all. The porcupine does not flee. Its quills point in every direction. Strike it from any angle, and you'll be reminded that some things were not made to be conquered. We have traveled together across 3 centuries of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. From the forest chiefdoms of the Akan world to the golden court of Kumasi. From the battlefield courage of Asanawa to the quiet persistence of a culture that survived everything the colonial world could throw at it. The Ashanti story is not a story that ends. It is a story that continues. In the workshops of Kumasi's goldsmiths, in the looms where Kent cloth is still woven in the ancient patterns, in the ceremonies where the Asantani is carried through the streets of a city, in the diaspora communities where Shawnee identity is taught to children who have grown up far from the forest. If this documentary has moved you, if it has taught you something or reminded you of something or made you see the world of African history with new depth and respect, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible to bring stories like this one to a global audience that deserves to hear them. Share this documentary with someone who would be changed by it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, your own connections to this history. And when you are ready, there is more to discover. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories of civilizations and peoples whose full complexity and achievement the mainstream historical narrative has too often compressed or ignored. The Ashanti are one chapter in a much larger story, a story of human ingenuity, resistance, and cultural endurance that spans every continent and every era. That story is waiting for you. The golden stool endures, and so does history when we choose to tell it honestly. Thank you for watching.